Draft week number 2, Jake Morley's back, and we've got a special guest. The NFL draft scout, Matt Miller, is here. Boys and girls, let's hit it. Oh, friends and family, it is so good to be back here in the Game On Wisconsin studios. This is the Gold Zone presented to you by Game On Wisconsin. I'm your host for the evening. I am Jacob Westendorf, and I'm joined by somebody that I claimed was me earlier, and it was not me, so I very much apologize to everybody, but that is Jake Morley. And Jake, the reason I gave was I so badly want to be you sometimes that I forget that I am me. But how are we doing?
Yeah. You can be me today, man. I'll tell you what, we were just talking to Matt on the pre-production show about the rolling power outages that have been coming through Kansas City, and that has not been fun. And then on top of that today, trying to fix my my light fixture in my dining room, and I think I ruined half the electricity in my house. So if there are any electricians out there listening right now, slide into those DMs and hook me up, because I don't know what I'm doing. But I'm doing good, man. Besides that,
that's a good phrase to continue to use. I don't know what I'm doing, but somebody who does know what he's doing is the great Matt Miller is joining us tonight. Matt Miller, you can follow him on Twitter at NFL Draft Scout. And Matt, I just had this whole thing going through my head. I'm so used to saying Matt Miller of Bleacher Report, and obviously you are on your own now, onto some bigger things and doing your own. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing and what you're calling it?
Yeah, Jacob, it's weird because for 10 years, people would say Matt Miller of Bleacher Report. And it's taken some getting used to for me, even to be like, oh, that doesn't come after my name anymore. So you're right. I want to clear up some there's this thing of people like, oh, he got fired from Bleacher Report. I did not. I left. I decided to leave. 10 years, I felt like I'd accomplished everything there that I could possibly accomplish. And it was like, hey, I'm ready to do my own thing. Folks who followed me for the last 10 years or have heard my story would know that I went to Bleacher Report as like an upstart blogger. You know, I carved my own path and happened upon Bleacher Report way before it was what it is now. You know, it was like 25 of us in a closet in San Francisco, basically. And so I really just seeing where that company ended up, you know, after great years and friendships, I'm ready to just get back into the ground floor and actually have to grind a little bit. You get complacent when you've worked the same place for a decade. You know what's expected of you, and you can match that pace. I was tired of doing that. I wanted to be challenged again and actually have to work for my living. So I launched a new website called thedraftscout.com. It actually launched February 11th with a 7-round mock draft. I've already put up a top 300 big board, put out an article on Deshaun Watson landing spots. My weekly scouting notebook column that comes out every Tuesday morning, that dropped earlier this week. So it's been refreshing getting to write again, and also having time to do stuff like this where, you know, I've known Morley for years and have never had time to do stuff like this. And so it's great to just have time now to kick back and talk ball with fans and analysts from all over the country.
Well, welcome. Yeah, we appreciate your time, and obviously, I'll let Jake jump in here in a minute. I want to. No,
I was just gonna say, man, it is fun to finally have you on doing something Packers, because as all the Packers fans know, Matt, you hate Green Bay. You hate the Packers.
I have read
every time you do a mock draft. Why do you hate the Packers so much, man? We already got people in the comments talking about linebackers. I gotta pull these up.
Right.
Why did you give the Packers an inside linebacker in the first round? Unbelievable. But
I got a lot of that on Twitter.
Let's talk about it, because if you have not signed up for Matt's and what it is, it's like a subscript, right? It's like a newsletter type deal. And it's awesome. We've already gotten the first, top 300 mock draft. which was a lot of fun. And let's talk about the first 2 picks before we get into talking about going back years. There's something I want to bring up from a couple years ago. But in your mock for the Packers, in the first 2 picks, you gave them Nick Bolton out of Missouri, the inside linebacker, and Rondale Moore, the wide receiver out of Purdue. I think a lot of Packers fans would be really happy with Rondale Moore in the second round. But what was your thought behind giving Green Bay an inside linebacker round 1?
Yeah, fellas, with a mock draft, I do a mock draft based on what I've heard, not what I would do. And so I was explaining to someone the other day. So in the absence of great intel, normally you would look at a team's track record and try to connect dots, right? And I know a lot of Green Bay fans are going to be like, we have never drafted an inside linebacker early. They do not value this position early, to which I will very politely remind you guys, you traded up for a quarterback last year, drafted a running back in the second round. So let's stop talking about what this GM who's been there for 2 years would do. We have to break away from those molds of Andy Reid had never traded up for a quarterback before, but oh yeah, Patrick Mahomes was there. So I understand that, I'm a fan of a team. I won't mention them here. I grew up a fan of a team.
San Francisco.
I'm hanging on by a thread there, by the way. So you fall into these traps of, well, my team doesn't value this, but things do change. And what I've tried to educate my readers on is that this team has never drafted a linebacker early, but they've never had these players in front of them, and they've never had this roster. Every draft is a unique snowflake that has to be evaluated on its own instead of, we got a type, we're not doing that, because that's how teams stay bad. I remember when the New York Jets drafted Jamal Adams and Marcus May, there was a person there I was close with. I hit him up. It was like, hey, what do you think of, I think it was actually Derwin James, if I have my memories right. He's like, I don't know, don't evaluate safeties. We have Marcus May, Jamal Adams. It's like, well, that's kind of foolish. What if they don't work out? So you always have to be prepared for what if a move doesn't work out. And so with Nick Bolton, it was a marriage of need and value. And while understanding this maybe is not where the front office has prioritized positions before, but I think we saw last year that maybe we don't understand this front office's value of these positions. And also, one last thing on this, anyone who watched the Super Bowl should know that the stock market for inside linebackers is like GameStop, a couple weeks ago. It's as high as it's ever going to go because everybody wants that run and chase inside linebacker. That's Nick Bolton or Jabril Cox, Jamin Davis, whoever it might be. That value is through the roof right now.
Well, and one thing I can point on, Jake, is just real quick before you jump in, is the year they drafted Rashawn Gary, there were whispers that if Devin Bush had been there, that would have been the Michigan defender that Green Bay would have drafted instead of Rashawn Gary. So, I mean, we'll never know. But right. I think that's a possibility of if they could find a stud, and maybe they just didn't think Patrick Queen and Kenneth Murray last year were studs and trying to figure that portion of things
I know with
out
Queen,
too.
Sorry, we're going off the rails here, but I know with Queen, there was a lot of concern about his coverage ability. I mean, every team I talked to loved the person, they loved the athleticism. It was like, he's not that good in coverage. I'm a Texas fan, and I mean, that was his first start in college. He got abused in the passing game. So, there was some truth to that. So, and with Kenneth Murray, it was like, yeah, he's a run stuffer, but his stats are inflated. He's not that great in coverage. So with a Jabril Cox or with a Nick Bolton or a Jamin Davis from Kentucky, this is a different type of athlete than what has been available to them in the past.
Yeah, and I was just going to add to what you said. Like you hit the nail on the head multiple times with what you're saying with the way this defense is already constructed. Really, if you want to go to the next level and you look at the teams that gave the Packers trouble this last year, it's teams with stud inside linebackers. I mean, Tampa Bay twice, Darius Leonard in Indianapolis. Like they have firsthand experience of dudes that can just wreck stuff for you on the defensive side of the ball. And so I think you're absolutely right. And I think to kind of marry what you said as well, every single pick Brian Gutekunst has made in the first round so far, I've been surprised. So
yeah, same. I did too.
So it's like, okay, like you throw someone out there, and I mean, the only really wild pick I think you could throw out there again is another quarterback this year. But I don't think that'll happen. So speaking of this team and the way this team has been constructed the last couple of years, Matt, when you were at Bleacher Report, you used to have a lot of meetups and stuff. And I remember 2 or 3 years ago in Mobile. And I don't know if you'll remember this because both of us were pretty overserved. There was a lot of libations flowing that evening, but that was the night that our buddy had to get basically carried out of draft. Was it draft picks? Is that where it was?
It was, yes.
And but to my point that I'm bringing up is that was the same week that the Packers went out and hired Matt LaFleur. And I remember both of us sitting down there, and we both were kind of like, I don't know, man. Like, is this like he's 38 years old coming in with Aaron Rodgers, almost the same age as him? What's he really done? Kind of the rumors around the league were, is he ready? Like, is he ready to be an NFL coach? And here we sit 2 years later, and I just want to get your perspective on his first 2 years, and has your opinion changed on him, and why has it changed on him if it has?
Yeah, no, I remember that night, despite the being overserved at Draft Picks Tap Room. And, my connections in the league at that time, everybody was like, this guy, it's a year early. He needs another year to prove that it's him, and that it's not, that it's not Mike Vrabel, that it's not, some of the older guys. I want to say their O-line coach at the time kind of had some hype as well. And so it's like, okay, well, let's see if he can sink or swim. And also I was skeptical because it was that summer, or excuse me, the offseason of, if you've ever worked next to Sean McVay, you're going to get a job. And so it was a lot of guys, Zach Taylor being another one, who were getting jobs without having proved themselves. And I think with LaFleur, that was the biggest skepticism on my part. I think he's proven himself very well. And, the key is obviously, being able to get over that hump, being able to win an NFC championship game is the thing, 2 years in a row, getting taken down by offenses that are just able to completely control what they do. As an offensive guy, obviously that's probably not on the floor as much as it's on his DC, and we're going to see a new one there this upcoming season. But I do think that the thing I've always been worried about with Sean McVay coaching staffs, and this is, I would say, Gruden and McVay, those coaching trees, is these guys are really good throughout the week of let's build a game plan. But when they get outside that script, they don't adjust very well. And I think that's where we've seen the Shanahan coaching tree do a little bit better at being able to adjust on the fly, being able to coach up, be a second half team, for lack of a better phrase. And so I think with Sean, with John Gruden, with Matt LaFleur, we have to see these guys prove that they can make adjustments outside their script. And I do think that's where, as a coach, you can be a great schemer or you can be an innovator. And I think Kyle Shanahan, I'm not just being a Niners homer here, Kyle Shanahan's an innovator. Andy Reid's an innovator. They're good with their script, but also they will find your weakness and exploit it. And I think that's where Sean and Matt have to get better is, when they're down, it's over almost. And I think, they came back a little against Tampa. That surprised the hell out of me. But that's where I think the next step for him, and he's still incredibly young, the next step will be finding a way to keep the foot on the gas. And, Jake, you're in Kansas City. I'm just not far from there. We saw this with Andy Reid when he got to KC. It was like, you're so good in the first half, but then you take your foot off the gas. You're too conservative, and they're letting teams like the Colts come back in the postseason. So I think that's where LaFleur has to find his own juice of, how do I be a guy that can put my foot on the throat and dominate this team?
Yeah. Speaking of finding the juice, and you mentioned getting over the hump in the NFC Championship game, and that's where they've been each of the last 2 years, obviously railroaded by San Francisco the year prior. And then this year, you can call it a one-possession game. It feels like maybe a game that wasn't as close as maybe the final score might indicate. I don't know how your feelings are on that, but one guy that could potentially be a home run swing, if you will, to try and put them over the top if they can get the finances to work out, is JJ Watt. And what I have said this week was that JJ Watt, to me, is the perfect marriage of what the Packers need and what the draft results typically yield. If you look at defensive linemen, typically it takes them a while to find their way onto the field and being major contributors. If you look at Ed Oliver is a great example. If memory serves, you had Ed Oliver as a top 10 to 15 kind of player, top 10 player. Hasn't lived up to that as of yet. That's not to say that he won't, but he could at some point. He just has not yet. The Packers have a need along their defensive line, obviously, but drafting someone like Christian Barmore at 29 is very unlikely, I should say, to fix their woes along their defensive line. So what are your thoughts on them potentially adding somebody like Watt to their roster?
Yeah, Watt or Kawan Short, who was cut by Carolina. Yep. I think you can look at both those guys. Short has obviously been a little hurt the past several years, but someone who can, for lack of a better term, somebody who's ring chasing and still bring value, and be what we hoped Rashawn Gary would be, and be who they do need up front. And I think Watt, we're all making that connection, obviously, because he played at Wisconsin. The ties there with that rustic cabin in the woods that he trains at, which is the one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life. But I would say that even when it sounded like Watt was going to get cut like a month ago, I put out a list of teams that I thought made sense, and Green Bay was near the top because obviously the location. it is one of the few teams in the NFL where if you were surveying the landscape right now, you would say, well, no matter what they do in free agency and the draft, they're a Super Bowl contender. And there aren't a lot of teams you can say that for. Now teams that also run a scheme that is good for him and is a situation where he might want to be, where his wife plays in Chicago. You're not that far away from there. I can't see him going to the Bears. I think that'd be sacrilegious. So I do think you could connect a lot of dots. Now the key will be, we don't know what JJ's looking for. We don't know if he wants one more, a 2-year deal and a chance at a ring. If so, okay, Tampa, Green Bay, Kansas City, Buffalo. Those are probably your spots. Does he want a lot of money and a chance at a ring? Okay, that might be Indianapolis. That might be Cleveland. So that changes things. And I think right now we're all just trying to figure out what exactly does this player want, who's been in Houston the entirety of his career. And I thought last year, what a great bounce back year. He's not who he was during that reign of terror, the 3 years where he was getting 20 sacks a year, but there's still value there. And I would think that a lot like a Justin Houston, toward the end of your career, you're 30, 32 years old, let's go somewhere where you can be more of a situational guy. You don't have to be on the field 90% of the snaps, and you can still be really competitive. You can still get your stats, and you can make good money while being on a team that has a chance to win a ring. So I think Green Bay's up there for that. But until we know exactly what JJ wants, it's hard to power rank his destinations right now.
And as pointed out here in the chat, one thing that Ed Werder did point out today, that reporting that quarterback, supporting cast, and money, those are your top three things. Well, when you talk quarterback, obviously there aren't many, if any, better than Aaron Rodgers. Supporting cast wise, you mentioned Rashawn Gary, who was an ascending player by the end of the year. Zadarius Smith, one of the better players, and then Kenny Clark. Obviously, that's a very formidable front four if they can add him to that. The money part, we can wait and see on if that's going to go there too. So,
and it's hard to know because we don't know what the salary cap is. It could be 185, it could be 195. Who knows? Everybody's waiting to see what that cap figure is going to be. And I think that's a big part of it. This might not be a quick thing unless he does go to a team where the cap situation and you can commit whatever it is that he wants.
Yeah, and that's what I was just going to say, too. Everyone's on pins and needles waiting to see where J.J. Watt's going to go, and teams might just be like, hey, we're going to punt on this until we know what we can actually give you, man, because we have no idea, and we don't either right now. But looking at, the landscape of this Packers team going into the offseason, from your perspective, you mentioned that they're a team that they're ready to roll right now. They're still a really talented roster. They do still have some holes. What, in your view, is something that this Packers team could address in free agency or via the draft going into 2021?
Yeah, we spent a lot of time on the inside linebacker spot, so we can move off that. I do think that there are three positions I would highlight outside of that. Wide receiver position is well known, and we don't expect that to be a first-round pick, right, just based on history, though we could be surprised. So I do think, like you said, in my mock draft, I had Rondale Moore going there in the second round, give Aaron an explosive yards after catch performer, somebody who can also help in the special teams game. And I think this is still a copycat league. Everyone wants their Stephon Diggs, their Tyreek Hill. We saw it last year with Henry Ruggs being the first receiver off the board. Rondale Moore, if healthy, would be a first-round pick. And so that's the key is he healthy? What's what are we looking at? Because true freshman year at Purdue, he was the most explosive playmaker in college football, arguably. Last year, sophomore year, hamstring issue. This year, season starts late. He's not quite ready to go. So you have to vet that. It's almost like a season and a half that he didn't play. So you got to figure out what that is. So wide receiver is a pretty big need. There's a good class for it. And there's a lot of depth in round 2 and round 3. I think secondarily, look at the corner position. I loved Kevin King. We can all admit we were wrong. Okay. It's the rare Iowa miss. It's like there's one every 20 years. This is it. This is our one we can say, okay, didn't work out. So I think that's when we're at the corner position, whether that's at, pick 30 or in the second or third round, because there is good corner depth this year, especially if you want to commit to somebody that can play inside. There's an Elijah Molden out of Washington. There's Sean Wade out of Ohio State, who's probably going to be a third or fourth round pick, but there's really good value at the corner position. I know Daniel Jeremiah has done a great job of highlighting Kelvin Joseph, who transferred from LSU and then bust out of the scene this year at Kentucky. He was a really, really good player. So he would be somebody in the first round you would take a look at. I know somebody said J.C. Horn. I don't know that Jaden at UCF is another player who would fit that mold. And then I think the offensive line, while the 5 starters you're probably comfortable with, we saw what injuries did to this team. When Bakhtiari goes down, you start shuffling things around. So a swing tackle, somebody who can play all 3 interior spots, those are super, super valuable. And I know you guys have to absolutely love Quinn Miners from Wisconsin Whitewater. His ability to play either guard and center spot. Now, the thing is, he might be a third-round pick at worst at this point. So it's just how early do you want to invest in somebody who is going to shore up the interior, but we don't quite know exactly where he would play day one. So those are three spots that I don't know how involved this team gets in free agency. You know, we've seen them at times make splash moves with the Smith brothers. Other times we've seen them completely ignore it. So that's always the toughest part of Green Bay is figuring out, are they aggressive this year or are they not? And we just don't know that yet.
Yeah, and I think the cornerback position is an interesting one too. And you look at, I just watched Greg Newsome, the second from Northwestern the other day.
Yeah.
And he's a kid that I think is going to – I mean, I think he already is. I think DJ had him going 21 to the Colts, but you throw on his tape and it's like, man, I don't see why not, you know, if the injuries are behind him.
What's crazy is he's the second best corner there. I can't think of the kid's name because he's not draft eligible, but they have a freshman or sophomore there who's better. It's just Pat Fitzgerald knows what he's doing.
Yep. And Green Bay loves that Northwestern connection. Pat Fitzgerald was linked to the Packers head coaching gig before they gave it to LaFleur. So that would be a really interesting one, a guy to keep an eye on as a Packers fan, because I think that might be the range that he ends up going in his end of round one. Jacob, I think you had the next question queued up.
I sure do. And then my question is, Brian Gutekunst has been replaced and Matt Miller was hired as the general manager of the Green Bay Packers. So you have between March and April 28th. Well, May 1st, I guess we could go all 3 days of the draft just as a general sense to fix the team. So other than cutting Aaron Rodgers, who again, as we mentioned earlier, you hate him. What are you doing to get this Packers team into Super Bowl 56?
If I'm still a Niners fan, I trade Aaron Rodgers to San Francisco for a 6th round pick. That's the second move.
Jordan Love era.
I gotta tell you, Kyle Shanahan with Aaron Rodgers is like, that's the one thing I'm rooting against is San Francisco getting Deshaun Watson, because Shanahan has never, even Matt Ryan at his peak is really good. Shanahan's never had a guy like that. And to me, Shanny's the best coach in football behind Andy Reid and Bill Belichick. I don't think there's any question.
Thank you.
That.
I agree. Yeah. So if I had to win with this team, I would probably sit out free agency this year, just with the uncertainty of the salary cap, and not sit out, but I would bargain shop. And I don't have a list of free agents in front of me. I apologize for that, but I would go the New England route of let's bargain shop in free agency, because we're going to see a lot of players, guys, want 1 year deals because they know the cap is going to make a gigantic jump next year. So this is a year where you want to spot fill in free agency and not chase needs. And so I think that's why the Green Bays of the world are going to be sitting pretty, because they can spot fill for a year. You can bring in a JJ Watt for a year. You can bring in a Kawan Short, a Justin Houston. You can bring in those veterans who are good players and you know exactly who they are and say, okay, for a year, we're going to roll with this, but we have to build through the draft this year. So my focus would be entirely on the draft. And I mentioned linebacker earlier. I know it's not a sexy pick for this team, but that is where my entire focus would be round one, because I think that the shelf at linebacker, there are 4 or 5 who are probably top 32 players for me. After that, there's a really big drop off. And so I would look at linebacker round 1, wide receiver round 2, and corner round 3, because I am pretty much out on drafting receivers in the first round unless they look like Calvin Johnson or Julio Jones. There's too much value in round 2, unless something like a Justin Jefferson falls, where you have a top 12 player sitting on the board in the 20s. Okay, if Devonta Smith is there, sure, let's pull the trigger. Otherwise, I would rather wait on an Elijah Moore, a Rondell Moore, Terrace Marshall Jr. from LSU, players that better value in round 2. And then in round 3, I would clean up at the corner position and look at the Shaun Wades, the Elijah Moldens, the Mukamua from South Carolina. There are just too many good corners, and so that's the way I see the positional value with this draft lining up. Because I think if you pass on linebacker in round 1, okay, let's swing around to pick 62. The linebackers who are on the board are not starting caliber. And so I try to look at it as, if I leave the first 3 rounds of the draft with, let's say we get Jabril Cox in round 1, Rondell Moore in round 2, and then a corner like Elijah Molden in round 3, those are 3 guys who can play right away. As opposed to if I take a corner in round 1, a wide receiver in round 2, well, that linebacker in round 3 is not playing. He's not getting on the field. And so I try to stack it that way of like, where are the positional values at, and how many starters can I get out of this class, which I think is where what I do and what fans want to see, that's where there's a little bit of a disconnect sometimes of like, oh, why'd you do this in round 1? And it's truly because in a 7-round mock draft, I'm looking at the domino effect of, if I take a linebacker here, what do I have in round 2? How do I fill my need in round 3 with what I expect to happen with those other picks? So those are the three positions I'd try to shore up. Also, I would sign Aaron Jones like day one. And I know everybody's like, don't sign running backs, don't sign running backs. I love Aaron Jones, and I think that he, like Alvin Kamara, is an exception to the rule of don't sign running backs. Now, he doesn't get like a Zeke Elliott deal, obviously, but I think it's time that somebody resets the running back market with common sense money, and Aaron Jones would be a big part of that.
Man, that was a question that I didn't think we were going to have time to get to, but you just answered right there for us. Would you pay Aaron Jones? Matt Miller, give him his money. All right.
Well, yes, common sense money, right?
So what is common? I mean, before we let you go here, what is common sense money for an Aaron Jones look like? What are we talking per year?
So again, I don't have the averages in front of me, but I feel like if you can get Aaron Jones for what, 14 a year, I was going to say,
if you want a thought on like the franchise tag number, Over the Cap had that as for running backs about $8 million.
$8 million? Okay, that's a bargain. Never mind, tag his ass. We'll ride it for 2 more years, and then right. Never mind. So actually, my big thing on running backs has been draft them, tag them, get them out. And I thought Dallas should have done it with Zeke. You got 5 years on the rookie deal, tag, see ya. And it's like a rental car, or a first wife. Got you for a little bit.
Oh my God.
Then we'll move on, something like that. So I had to leave you with something good, right?
I'm so thankful my wife doesn't watch the show. That's incredible. He's Matt Miller. You can follow him on Twitter at NFL Draft Scout. Matt, appreciate your time. We'll have to have you back before this thing kicks off in late April. And obviously go find it at NFLDraftScout.com, correct?
TheDraftScout.com. Don't piss the NFL off.
Yeah, good, smart. Yeah, very good idea on that. I'll have to give you, I got a story about that on my own at some point. So thanks for stopping by, and be sure to subscribe to his site. What's that? I think it was like $80 or something like that for a year subscription or something like that.
Even cheaper, $70 a year. So you can't beat it, or you can do it monthly. And we have our second round of member mock drafts where 2 lucky people will get to be GM of the Packers, and we'll do 2 separate mock drafts. We'll do it live, where just like this, we'll be in a room doing the picks, and I'll moderate and grade the drafts. So it's a pretty good time.
So there you have that, guys. $70. You divide that by 12. That's less than $7. That's not even a lunch a week. If you give up 1 lunch a week, you can get draft content. I can tell you, as somebody that read the scouting notebooks every week when you were at Bleacher Report, and obviously check them out now, that alone is worth the subscription. So be sure to check those out. Again, Matt Miller at NFL Draft Scout. Appreciate you stopping by, and we look forward to the Packers not doing anything that you said they should. So
going wide receiver round 1 for the first time. I appreciate you guys. Please let me know when I can come back and hang out and do this again.
Anytime.
Take care, buddy.
Thanks.
That was Matt Miller, obviously formerly of Bleacher Report, now his own thing. And apparently Jamarcus Russell is trying to make some extra money. So thank you, Luke, for stopping by this week. I am always appreciative on that. Jake, so a few things. Let's digest that a little bit before we move into our topic for the week, because we do have some spare time now. What were some takeaways of some of the things that you said? Or excuse me, not that you said, that he said.
I'm surprised he was pro pay Jones. But I like the philosophy that he laid out. I don't know how that plays in a locker room. And I think that's maybe what the issue would be. But if anyone were willing to play on a franchise tag for 2 years, it'd probably be Aaron Jones, who is one of the most stand-up dudes ever, which is also why I want to see him get paid. But man, if you can, if bargain money is $14 million a year for a running back, I think that's a little high. But if you want to give Aaron Jones $8 million a year for the next 2 years, play on the franchise tag, I would do that. I mean, if that were the deal, you could sign me up for that. Or if you could sign me up for a 2-year deal for Aaron Jones for $16 million, I would take. I mean, you take that in a heartbeat. You would sign that yesterday for him,
right?
So I think that was interesting. I think it's interesting for Packers fans to hear someone that is not a Packers fan to say something like, Green Bay is one of the few teams in the NFL that is ready to roll for a Super Bowl next year. Because it is absolutely true. We take it for granted how special of a run this has been the last 20, 25, 30 years, where this team is just ready to win a Super Bowl at the drop of a dime. And he's not making that up. This team is still loaded. And I know the further and further we get removed from that NFC Championship game, that hurts, that stung. you're still looking at this team and saying, all right, a lot of talent on this team. And as long as 12 is still the quarterback, why not, man? Go out and win a Super Bowl. Those were the two biggest takeaways I had. And I love that he just unpromptedly brought up Aaron Jones as well. That was great.
You said stung as if it still doesn't hurt. One thing I do want to talk about real quick, as far as cap space, guys, like Matt Miller pointed out, nobody knows what the cap number is. And this isn't to discredit the work that some of the great cap people do on twitter.com, Over the Cap, Spot Track. They all have great stuff. Nobody knows what the salary cap number is. Everything that they say has like the fine print in it that says, assuming a blank salary cap, 180 mil, 175, 185. I've seen speculation the cap could remain flat and be 198. So until that number comes out, just me personally, this is my personal philosophy. I am not talking about the salary cap until I know what the number I'm working with is. I always say if they could find a way to make it work. That's the example I use when we talk about JJ Watt, for example. To get back to the point at hand here, the running back thing was interesting. One, because that's our topic tonight. Two, anytime somebody says I would pay a running back, it kind of causes you to raise your eyebrows, right? Because one of the peeves I have with draft Twitter specifically and NFL Twitter is the groupthink that comes into play. And if you say something that is outside the box or outside of the norms of thinking, you're chastised. And that was part of that. So the paying Aaron Jones part was interesting. I thought the linebacker stuff was interesting. It drops off a cliff after round 2. We'll see if the Packers value adding a starter there or if they're good with Chris Barnes and Kamal Martin as your likely starters at that position. I was a little surprised that he said he wouldn't address the cornerback position until the 3rd round. And that's something to me that seems a little late, but it certainly could happen. I think if there's one thing that we've learned about the Packers in the 3 years that Brian Gutekunst has been the general manager, he will not deviate from his board. And if that board says Jordan Love is number 1 on it, guess who they're picking? Oh yeah, number 10's on the roster as we speak. But I thought that was interesting as well. Obviously a lot of stuff to digest between now and April 28th when this draft kicks off for the Packers. So let's jump into our topic for the night, and that is running backs. And I do want to jump into that overall philosophy, and that is, Jake, do running backs matter? That's kind of the over-exaggeration point that people make, but do running backs matter, tongue-in-cheek, and what's your philosophy on selecting them?
I mean, of course, running backs matter, right? Like running the football is always going to be important in the National Football League. You saw it this year. The Packers' entire offense is predicated on running the football. So if you can't run the football, Aaron Rodgers doesn't throw nearly 50 touchdowns. Like that's just kind of how it works. I know there's data out there and there's analytics Twitter that will tell you actually, it doesn't make a difference if you run the ball or not. I don't buy that. So yes, running backs matter. That's why they took one in the 2nd round last year. And that's why I think A.J. Dillon's going to be a really nice player for them next year. Whether or not they pair him with Aaron Jones, I don't know. That would be the dream, right? Aaron Jones, A.J. Dillon, 2021. Yeah, let's roll. That'd be fun. But I think they're setting themselves up to not go that way. And I think the philosophy that is correct on running backs is similar to what Matt talked about. You draft them, you keep drafting, you keep churning them out because running backs do matter, but are they hard to find? Not always. If you invest resources into that position, more often than not, you're going to have a good player at that position. It's not like the quarterback position where, you can be wandering in the wilderness for 20 years looking for one. If you want a running back, you just go get one. You can find them. It's not to say there's never busts at running back. I mean, Trent Richardson comes to mind immediately as a guy that just wasn't good. But if you want a running back, you take them. The Packers have taken them. The Packers do care about the running back position. We'll see how much with that Aaron Jones contract. We'll see how much with Jamal Williams, what they do with him. So, yes, it matters. I think the philosophy is you just keep churning them out. Keep taking them. Keep finding guys that fit what you do well, and you just keep thriving.
Yeah, I'm with you. I say that to a point of I would not have drafted Ezekiel Elliott in the 1st round not in the 1st round, not 4th overall. And I said it as soon as they picked him. I don't care what their record was that year. And I think it's played out. Who's the best cornerback in football, Jake?
Well, Jair Alexander is.
Who was a first-team All-Pro corner?
Jalen Ramsey was in that draft class, what you're getting at.
And they drafted him instead of Jalen. And to me, that's something, it's no different than, the Giants taking Saquon Barkley over. At the time, we would have all said Sam Darnold, but Josh Allen, Josh Rosen stinks, but a quarterback. And now they have Daniel Jones, who I don't think is any good. And Saquon Barkley is coming off a blown up leg. And that's the other problem that you have with running backs is those guys, that position is volatile. And you look at, for example, Todd Gurley is a great example of this. Todd Gurley was the best running back in the NFL. And then at a snap of the fingers, unusable. CJ Henderson had a belly like mine in the postseason. And the Rams were Sean McVay, offensive genius. Sean McVay was using CJ Anderson in playoff games, Super Bowls, instead of Todd Gurley. And it's because Gurley was hurt and all of a sudden he's just kind of fallen off a cliff. And that's why I agree here. The point is you need depth at that position. That's why the Packers had 3 guys last year. I think that's why one of those backs is going to be back, or they'll sign a cheap veteran and add a guy later in the rounds, which we'll get to that here in just a minute. But I'm with you. I don't think the position doesn't matter. I think it's really disingenuous when people say that. I think the point is, can you find them later? And the answer is yes. Philip Lindsay, for example, was an undrafted free agent. He's been one of the top rushers, or I believe, won the rushing title in his rookie season as an undrafted free agent. That certainly matters. And I think that finding guys like that, finding where they fit and what you do, that certainly is important. And running the football, like you mentioned, should you be a team that runs the ball 65% of the time? No, it's not 1974 anymore, but you need to be able to run it a little bit. And you saw how much better the Packers offense was. Look at both Tampa Bay games. If you want an example, couldn't run it. Or in the case of the second game, didn't run it. And their offense was less efficient than it normally is. That it does matter. Now, you should be building around your passing game. That certainly is true. But they're not completely irrelevant the way some portions of Twitter may have you believe. Jake, let's move to our next point. My question is, who's the best running back in this class? And last week I said other than Trevor Lawrence, but this week I don't have to have that caveat.
No, man, this is a fun discussion because I think you have 3 guys. I think you have 3 guys at the top, and I think one might be surprising. Travis Etienne is going to be in that conversation. Najee Harris is going to be in that conversation. And a guy that I really think and I really, really like is Javonte Williams out of North Carolina. I think there is a clear, not maybe a clear path, but a path to look back at this draft in 3 years and say Javonte Williams was the best running back to come out of this draft class. The kid is 19 years old right now, going to be 20 on draft day, super young, not a lot of tread on his tires. Split the backfield with Michael Carter at North Carolina, so he doesn't have a ton of carries, and he is just a lot of fun when you turn the tape on and watch him. But I would say if you're going to say if you can have one running back for next year on your team out of all these guys, I'd take Najee Harris. I just really like what he brings, as a runner, but also a receiver out of the backfield. He's got the size and length and pass protection to be a dude as well. He was at the Senior Bowl. And you look at a guy like him, and so he's there with the best seniors in the country, and he just looks different. He's just one of those guys. You want to talk about Saquon Barkley or A.J. Dillon. Najee Harris is going to be in that conversation as well. He is an absolute freakazoid the way he is built. He's a legit 6'2", 230, maybe more. So I think I would take Najee Harris as my RB1 in this draft class, which probably means I wouldn't take him because he's going to go higher than what I would want to take a running back at.
Right. If Green Bay is picking Najee Harris, it's got to be with their first round pick, you would imagine, because he's not dropping all the way to their second round pick. So to answer your question, Mr. LeBeau here, and Etienne or Harris, any chance the Packers grab them? I think those are both guys. Etienne, to me, I think you can write it in pencil, is a Jacksonville Jaguar. Pick 33. Bang. Done. Right there with Trevor Lawrence. They'll have that pairing. Urban Meyer likes to rotate those running backs in and out like you've seen, and all that kind of stuff certainly I think matters, but I don't think that they're going to do that. I'm with you though. I think Harris is the guy. I watched him it looked like the Ohio State national championship game. He got hit by one of their corners coming full speed at him, and he just bounced off of him. Like, there's something to be said about that. You know, the offensive line coaches, the Owen Reeses of the world, are going to call those body blows. And that's somebody, and we've seen it, right? You watched A.J. Dillon against the Tennessee Titans. Business decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Those are things. They are made by defensive backs when you're one-on-one with a guy like that. And that was something that was not a business decision, but it probably led to some others. And I think Harris is a guy that can do that. I watched ETN this year, and when he came back this year, I was curious as to why. What more do you have to prove? And I just, you know, some of the games I watched, I just kind of came away, meh. I could see the skill set. I could see where he fits in with what the Packers do. But, you know, when you're a senior like he is, I value, do you not do stupid things? And an example I can use is the first Notre Dame game. He was horrible. And one of the biggest plays of the game was a pitch that he just flat dropped and was returned for a touchdown. That was a huge play in that game. And he kind of struggled for most of the night. So, like I mentioned, that's something that I value, especially when you're an older player like that, because those rookie mistakes, if you will, should be gone because he's played on those stages. But the value of pairing someone, and let's get into that a little bit. It's not really in our agenda, so to speak, but do you value at all pairing somebody that's different from A.J. Dillon? So, for example, if Najee Harris is sitting there at 62 or whatever it is that something that you're going to be like, no, we can't take him because we have A.J. Dillon and they're the same guy?
Man, if Najee Harris is sitting there at 62, the Packers might take 2 running backs in the second round 2 years in a row. Because no, I mean, get a stud running back. I mean, a guy that's good is a guy that's good. Is there value in pairing a guy with A.J. Dillon that may be a little bit more, you know, the old cliche saying is the lightning to his thunder. And that's great. You know, if you compare a guy like that, that's what Aaron Jones would be. But like, would you say Aaron Jones is just a scat back, just a lightning type back? He's not. He's he's a pretty good down, you know, 3rd and 1 type back. So, man, it just if a running back can play and you can give those guys, you know, series, it's still different. You know, it's still a different look. Or if you can give me an A.J. Dillon, like someone that runs like him, and now I have 2 battering rams that I can wear you down with the whole game, I'm fine with that too. And that's actually an interesting question is if a guy like, let's say like Javonte Williams, who is probably shouldn't be there at the end of the second round, super talented. If he's number 1 on your board, do the Packers take a running back again in the second round? I don't know. It's going back to what we talked about with Miller. Everything they do. I mean, I really don't know what this team is going to do. I feel like with Ted, we were kind of spoiled in the sense of like we kind of had like our little like security blanket. Like we know what he likes to do. We know it's going to make, you know, maybe be a guy that we've never heard of, but usually they pan out. With Goody, it's just like, I have no idea what he's going to do. Like,
dart. Yeah, you're just as good.
Will they take a running back in the second round? Probably not, but I don't know. Maybe if they like
I think the point you made while Miller was here was great. Was first round picks. Jair Alexander, too short if Ted Thompson's the GM, right? Rashawn Gary, Darnell Savage, I think was semi-predictable, but Rashawn Gary was not. And Jordan Love certainly wasn't. One point I do want to get in. Stan Jones says in here, give me a 3-down back over A.J. Dillon. Let me say a couple things. First of all, A.J. Dillon is a 3-down back. He's maybe not as comfortable or natural in the passing game as someone like James White or Jamal Williams or something like that. But he caught the ball this year. And I think you're not asking him to run running back verts and throwing him the ball like that, but he's a 3-down back. And so is Najee Harris. Najee Harris, they were running quick screens and tunnel screens and stuff like that for him at Alabama. So they certainly have those abilities. Don't let the fact that A.J. Dillon weighs 285 pounds distract you from the fact that he is able to make plays in the passing game. But I think the one thing you can say is whatever Gutekunst's board says, and that's the thing where we don't know, right? But he's going to stick to it. That's how you draft Josiah DeGuara in the 3rd round, of a guy that everybody says they could have gotten him later. I think after Dalton Keene goes like 5 picks later or whatever it was, that theory kind of gets dispelled a little bit. But the best example of sticking to your board is Jordan Love. And I think that is something you have to keep in mind as they go through here is, yes, they do address their needs. because they have. Somebody says, when has Gutekunst ever addressed a need in the first round? Well, you guys are letting recency bias get in the way if that's the case, because Jair Alexander, corner, was the team's biggest need, and he drafted 2 of them with his first 2 picks. Edge rusher and safety were big needs coming into that draft. They drafted Rashawn Gary and Darnell Savage. So yes, he does address needs as well. It's just a matter of, does his board fall where value meets need, to use a old Ted Thompsonism, RIP. So that's kind of my thought on that. I think they would take a running back in the second round if they needed to, because if there's something that you've noticed about this Matt LaFleur offense as well, they used all 3 backs by the end of this season. By the end of the year, they were using Jones, Dillon, and Williams, maybe not equally, but they used all of them. And I love the idea that they were having at the end of the year where they'd have Aaron Jones go in motion and they're basically running RPOs with, okay, you're going to play the pass. And if you watch the way that the Rams played it, I think this was a great example. When they played the Bears, they threw that ball out, that little swing out to Jones a bunch. And then you watch the next week, watch those Rams linebackers, the way they just basically played the pass and said, okay, run it. Well, then A.J. Dillon punishes you. So that's where I think adding a guy like that who has a little wiggle in space, and that's why if I were playing Madden and could turn the salary cap off, yeah, I would love to have Aaron Jones back, because that really is that perfect thunder and lightning combination, if you will. But I don't think they would hesitate to take someone like Najee Harris. And the point that Miller made when he was here was when he talked to the Jets and he asked him, what do you think of Derwin James? Which, by the way, Packers fans, I don't think this is a thing anymore, but can we stop with the Derwin James thing if you haven't already? Jair Alexander is really effing good. Really effing good. And they made the right pick 100% by taking him instead of Derwin James, who's been injured for the last 2 seasons, basically. So that's beside the point. You don't evaluate Derwin James because you have Marcus May, who is still on the team, and Jamal Adams, who you traded away. Not being ready for stuff like that, piss poor. Another reason why they took a quarterback, because you look at, Jake, we were talking, not to get completely off the rails, but the salary cap situation. The upside to redoing Aaron Rodgers' deal is obvious. You get the cap space for this year. You could sign some guys to ring chase, go on a big run, or try to go on a big run. The downside, I advise everybody to go look at the Pittsburgh Steelers and the New Orleans Saints, where your quarterback is clearly cooked. And the Steelers are a great example of that right now. Ben Roethlisberger is done. Done. Anybody who watched him in the second half, this is the way I describe Ben Roethlisberger this season. I went into a fantasy playoff game on a Monday night. I was winning the game when the game started. At halftime, I was losing. That's how poor he had played in that first half. And if he hadn't thrown a touchdown, I think it was against the Browns. If he hadn't thrown a touchdown pass on that Monday nighter to James Washington, I would have lost that game. Absolutely. Ben Roethlisberger is done, and the Steelers have no choice. There's a $41 million salary cap hit to Ben Roethlisberger's contract. So when they say they're a value, they have to look at the current situation. You can't. There's nothing. What are you going to do? And what they did was probably make the best of the situation. Can they start Dwayne Haskins? Maybe. But if you're the Packers, do you really want to be in a position where you're like hoping Jameis Winston is good, hoping Dwayne Haskins is good, something of that sort? I say all that to say they shouldn't ignore a position just because they, maybe other than quarterback, because obviously that just wouldn't make a ton of sense at this point, unless Trevor Lawrence falls, in which case, sorry, Jordan, we love you, but deuces, homie. Anything that you have, even if offensive tackles, I've got people that have said, offensive line. And like I said, we are way off the rails here. Not that big of a need because David Bakhtiari is back. You have Billy Turner. It's like, okay, but when is the last time a team ever had too much offensive line depth? I am in the camp of, let's say they sign JJ Watt. You could draft an edge in the first round. If Kwity Paye's sitting there, run the card. Because when is the last time a team ever was accused of having too many pass rushers? The answer is never. There's no such thing. So moving to that, I think they would take a back in the second round. So now that we've gone off the rails, Jake, who is your favorite running back in this class?
Man. Well, let's look at it from, because I've already talked about Javonte Williams, the UNC kid. I do like him a lot, but let's look at this through the lens of, okay, let's say Aaron Jones is gone and they do want to pair A.J. Dillon with more of a guy that's more like Aaron Jones. So you can split him out into the slot. He's more of a jitterbug, can bust off an 80-yard run at any time. The good news is there's a lot of guys in this draft class that I like in that role. You talk about the other kid from North Carolina, Michael Carter. He is a lot like Aaron Jones when you watch him play. Very good out of the backfield as a passer. He's a guy that I think you can evaluate from, say, like third down going forward. You want to talk about a third down back. He's a guy that can be a threat out of the backfield on some of those orbit motions and stuff that they were running towards the end of last year. A guy that nobody is talking about right now, but I think they will be because he is electric. It is Kenneth Gainwell out of Memphis. He's only a redshirt sophomore. He's only like 195 pounds. He's a smaller guy, but he is electric city. Did someone just say Gainwell before I said him? Man, nice.
Yeah.
You're smart.
That's our guy, man.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, no, he's good. He's a good player. He's someone I just watched this week. A lot of fun. But then you jump down a little bit, and so those guys are probably day 2 type players. You want to jump down to day 3. I think there's guys that are still even there. Trey Sermon, Ohio State, nice player. A guy that's really interesting to me and stood out at the Senior Bowl is Khalil Herbert. And he is a Virginia Tech kid, played at KU for his first several years, 3 or 4 years, whatever it was, and then transferred to Virginia Tech. But he's a really nice-looking receiver out of the backfield. There were a couple plays where he absolutely put Tuff Borland in the dirt in pass pro as well, which I think is going to happen to Tuff a lot when he gets to the NFL. But either way, there were some nice reps. And the last guy that I really like for this Packers team that I think is someone that you kind of go down a little bit further, and that is Larry Roundtree from Missouri. He was rumored that he dropped some weight to come into the Senior Bowl, and I think you could tell. I think he was one of the most impressive guys at the Senior Bowl as far as getting out into the backfield. He was really the only guy that was able to give Jabril Cox any trouble at the linebacker position in those one-on-ones. So there's a list of some guys to keep an eye on if the Packers are looking to replace Aaron Jones, who, mind you, was a 5th-round draft pick out of UTEP, who is going to be viewed, coming out of school, coming out of UTEP, probably in a similar mold that some of those guys that I just listed are. So there's always those diamonds in the rough, and there are a few that I think if you're looking at, hey, here are some shiny new toys for Matt LaFleur's offense. Some guys that could do some damage.
One thing I want to point out about Patrick Taylor, our guy Mike Wendland asked this question. Maybe, my thing on him is always if he was a practice squad running back. Coming into this season, there was a lot of hype for Dexter Williams potentially taking that step, and Dexter's one of those guys that I think if you got some truth serum into Matt LaFleur and Brian Gutekunst, they would tell you that decision the first year where he made the roster over Trey Carson was we drafted this dude, we didn't draft this dude kind of situation. So with Taylor, it's just hard to feel anything about him. We haven't seen him do anything in an NFL uniform. Now you can see the skill set, obviously coming out of college, but I just don't know. And I think, you don't ever want to be counting on a guy like that to be your complement to A.J. Dillon, if you will. There's a reason guys were drafted. There's a reason guys weren't. And some guys slipped through the cracks. Tom Brady, that's the go-to line. He was picked 199th overall, and now he's the greatest quarterback of all time, and all that other cringeworthy nonsense that makes me want to throw up anytime I think about him. But there are some things like that, but I just don't know. A name that, if you mentioned it, I apologize, I missed it, but a name that didn't come up, and he was at the Senior Bowl as well, Demetric Felton. And I know that's going to be a name that gets a lot of hype over the Packers Twitterverse, if you will, and he kind of already has. But I look at him and I see
he's a wide receiver, Jacob.
He's a receiver.
He's not. He played some running back his senior year at UCLA, but if you go back to 19 and 18, he played exclusively wide receiver at UCLA, and I think that's where he's going to end up. But yeah, if the Packers want, like I said, shiny new toy, absolutely. So yeah, talk to me about your Felton love.
Yeah, it's Tyler Ervin on steroids. I mean, nothing against Tyler Ervin, but Ervin is a guy who is an upgradable, replaceable type of player that you could plug a guy in like him. And with Felton, you can get those forced touches, if you will, the jet sweeps, the little pop passes, the orbit motion stuff that you talked about with Aaron Jones. I think he's a great role player for stuff like that. And I think that if you could even plug him in the slot, like you mentioned, I don't give a damn what position he plays. Call him a running back, call him a receiver. I do not care. Get him the ball. That's what he's good at. What is he good at? Having the ball in his hands and moving. His route running ability was on display at the Senior Bowl. You mentioned that. You can line him up in the backfield. Think about it like the way the Packers used Ty Montgomery is another good example of that. Tyler Ervin this year, like I mentioned, is a good example of that. But I think you could plug him in. If you're thinking about him as the true complement to A.J. Dillon, then yeah, you're probably going to be a little disappointed with what you're going to get, because you can't line him up and run between the tackles for, 10 yards, 12 yards, those kinds of things. You might, but he's more of a gadget player, I guess, than a running back. I think that's absolutely fair. Another name you mentioned, a guy like Trey Sermon, and, the Ohio State Buckeyes, I give them, they deserve so much sympathy because they never seem to catch a break. And they had this guy transfer to them, and they were able to fall forward once again. They fire Jim Tressel, and they're able to hire Urban Meyer, and then they fire Urban Meyer, and they're able to hire Ryan Day and just keep that machine on a roll. And they never catch a break down there in Columbus. But Sermon was a guy who took him a little while to get acclimated to the offense. I think it took a while for the Buckeyes to realize how they wanted to use him. And frankly, I think it took a while for them to realize he was their best running back. And that makes some sense when you think about it. He transferred there, whereas number 33, and I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he had been there for a couple of years as their running back. Sermon by the end of the year had surpassed him. And somebody in this chat here, Jason, sorry, Z, I can't pronounce your last name, but said huge outside zone running back with contact balance. I think that's great. And the Packers, they're yes, Teague. And he has an interesting first name too. Thank you, Mike.
Master.
Master. Yes. Master Teague. Yes. Okay. I'm trying to delete the Buckeyes from my head because I hate that they exist, but they do. Anyways, the idea that Green Bay hasn't really had a guy, Aaron Jones, obviously, but they don't have somebody that can run that outside zone stuff as well if Dillon is your main runner. So that ability to kind of attack the edges of defenses, which when the opposing team's linebackers are not Devin White and Levante David or Fred Warner and some of those dudes they've had in San Francisco, it feels like Patrick Willis and Navarro Bowman just keep getting reincarnated in San Francisco. But the ability to attack running games on the edges, I think, is where run defenses, and the Packers are a really good example of this, can be their most vulnerable, because you're asking those linebackers to chase, sift through a lot of junk. The edge rushers kind of play the run on the way to rushing the passer kind of thing. And I think a lot of edge rushers are wired that way because it ain't sexy to stop the run. I totally understand that. But I like the idea of Trey Sermon being a back on that as well. Whoever's in here, Mr. Nixon, Tom Brady is not the greatest of all time. So I'm sorry to point that out to you, but he's the most accomplished. He ain't the greatest. Sorry. That's just going to be the case. That's kind of my thought on pairing those guys with that. So what round do you think, we kind of talked about this a little bit, is Green Bay targeting a running back?
That's tough. Last week all of us were just like, no, for quarterback, like that. That's the one position I think you can look at and say, like, man, it just ain't going to happen, right? Like, they're just not going to be able to be taking a quarterback. This year, I don't know. I don't know. I don't see a first-round running back coming through Green Bay, but I didn't see a first-round quarterback coming through Green Bay last year either. So that's a tough one. And I could see them going as early as the second round. If the board falls the way they want it to fall, or if one of these guys falls, and let's say ETN is sitting there at the end of round 2, let's say Williams is there, or maybe even Michael Carter at the end of round 2, he's getting a lot of buzz. Could that be something that they go after? Maybe, just because it would really tick off a lot of Packers fans. So I think you look at your pissed off level and look at where we would most be upset. And I think running back would be kind of upsetting for a lot of people in the second round again, but they don't care. Let me tell you that.
For the record, let me cut you off here too. Not only do they not care, they shouldn't. And I'm happy that they don't, because what was the old saying? I don't remember who said it, but I think it was Bill Walsh. As soon as you start listening to the fans, you start sitting with them. So Ted Thompson wasn't listening to the fans when he drafted Aaron Rodgers. How's that worked out? Pretty good, right? Now, obviously, when you are a armchair GM, it's very easy to sit back and say, man, they should have picked TJ Watt instead of Kevin King. And I don't mean to keep beating that dead horse, but it's easy to say that from where we sit. When you're in that position, go back to the time of that draft, guys. And I'm not justifying the pick because I would have taken Watt myself, but I'm also an idiot. So take that for what it's worth too. At the time, if they hadn't taken a corner and they would have rolled into training camp the following year with their starting corners being Devon House, and Sam Shields was broken by then, and Tramon Williams was gone. And I mean, I don't even know who their starting corners were that year, but Ladarius Gunter could not be a starting corner at that point. And that is what drafting Kevin King did. Now it didn't work out. Like Matt mentioned, it's one of those rare misses you get from Washington, but it happens. And I think that I'm happy that Brian Gutekunst doesn't listen to idiots like me, because you know what? A great example of this very well could be Jair Alexander, because Jair Alexander would not have been my choice. I remember rolling my eyes when they picked him because I was concerned. And now looking back on it, I was like, most of my concerns were basically he's going to get hurt, which knock on wood, he hasn't as of yet. But they didn't listen to me. I would have drafted Josh Jackson. How do you guys feel about him? Very good question. So anyways, I'm sorry, go on.
No, I forgot what I was saying, but you're absolutely right with talking about drafting guys and not listening to us. I will say,
Joe, the answer is absolutely not. TJ Watt's awesome, but for example, the complaints about picking Dayton Jones instead of DeAndre Hopkins aren't near that stratosphere. So yes, his name is Watt. He went to Wisconsin, and there are other things at play there as well. But
you could do it every year. Every pick that didn't work out, go look at the guy within 5 picks after him that is good. Like, cool.
Well, and look at that draft class, because everybody that makes fun of, they're like, oh, the Packers, they passed on TJ Watt for Kevin King. It's like, okay, so did 29 other teams. Yeah. And if you go back and look at that draft, Myles Garrett was picked number 1. Any pick after that, you could justify TJ Watt. Any one of them, other than Patrick Mahomes and Deshaun Watson. That's it.
Yep. Before, because we're running out of time too, but I want to give, so we're on the position of running back, and I would be remiss if I did not mention, I'm going to give you guys a deep sleeper, some homework. Go watch this guy. This is our guest last week, Kent Swanson, actually gave me this name, and I turned the film on this week, and he's pretty good. His name's Gary Brightwell. He's a kid out of Arizona. A senior, never really had a full chance to be the dude in Arizona, but he's good. He's a good player. So go watch him. That's your homework for me for this week.
Probably recruited by Rich Rodriguez, so by default he sucks. That's my. Actually, he probably
still talking about Rich Rod.
Man, you want to talk about like coaching hires that I just was never on board for, and then watched him just tank Michigan's program. They're still recovering from that, like if you really think about it. But this isn't it kind of is a college football show, but it also isn't. So let's get to the end here, Jake. What are the chances that Green Bay picks a running back in the first 5 rounds?
Oh man, first 5 rounds, I'd say 50.5%. So I'm going a little bit with the over on that, just a little bit with the over. I think it's a 50-50 shot. Like if a guy is there, they'll take him.
I'm going to go 65, and I'm saying that assuming Aaron Jones is gone. I've heard some whispers that Jamal Williams is probably more likely than not to be back, but even if that is the case, you need another guy because Williams is probably a 1 to 2 year type of deal, and thinking about things that way. I think it's 65%. I think they'll try and find whether it's a gadget type like Felton or Michael Carter or Javonte Williams. Those guys aren't gadget types, but a lightning, if you will, a home run hitter type. I think it's going to be a really good chance. And the other thing, Jason, 100%, I don't think that's overly confident, because if there's anything we've learned with Matt LaFleur, running backs matter, and he wants 3 guys that he can rotate in and out. And if you think about it, it was just not this past season, but the year prior, Dexter Williams and Trey Carson were getting carries because Jamal Williams was hurt, Aaron Jones was hurt, and that's how that went. So I think that's certainly a possibility as well.
And to cut you off too, last offseason, Goody rose some eyebrows when he said they would like to add another running back to that room. And we're all like, oh, okay. And then they drafted a guy in the second round. So, yeah, they love their running backs, and it's not a mistake to say they want 3 guys that can play.
No, and I think that it's probably smart. Now, how often should they be picking guys in the top 100? You can certainly debate that, but that doesn't even go back to, they were in on Mark Ingram. Like they wanted to sign Mark Ingram potentially when Gutekunst took over, and eventually he became a Baltimore Raven. And I just think that, yeah, you're right. They would take a running back if it were a possibility. But that is the end of this week's show. We appreciate you guys stopping by. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Jacob Westendorf. And you can follow the better version of Jake here at Jacob Morley. Next week, we'll be talking everybody's favorite position. Jake, I don't know if you heard, but the Packers did not draft a wide receiver last year.
They didn't. They did not. I'll tell you what, too, man. For the KC draft guide, that's what I write about is receivers and tight ends. So I'm looking forward to that next week. If there's one position that you want to hear about number 50 on the board, the 50th wide receiver, that's probably about the only position I could talk in depth that much about yet. So that's going to be a really fun episode next week. And a lot of dudes, a lot of guys that would look really good in green and gold next season at the wide receiver position.
That there would, and we'll talk about all of those next week when we're talking offensive line. Well, I got good news for you. Owen Reese is coming on the show for the offensive line. Next week, we will be with Eric Crocker, at Eric_Crocker of Crocker Report, former NFL player, to talk some receivers. So looking forward to having him and talk about some of those guys with us. But until then, follow us at Game On WI on Twitter. Find us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Game On Wisconsin, all that good stuff. Like and subscribe. That's what keeps this thing rolling. And you could send checks to my house. I would very much appreciate some money for these kinds of things too. So if you want to pay for this nonsense, you're more than welcome and invited and encouraged, honestly, to do so. But until then, we're out of time. We appreciate you guys listening this week. We'll be back next week, like I mentioned, with receivers. And I mentioned Eric Crocker. I mentioned Owen Reese. We got a pretty good guest for our tight end episode in 2 weeks as well. So go ahead and keep that in your back pocket and stay with us. But appreciate you guys stopping this week. We will see you guys next week talking receivers and maybe a little JJ Watt too. I don't know. That remains to be seen. But thanks for listening. We'll see you guys next week.